At 10 years old, she stood on the sagging porch board and said words that would settle into the soil like a seed that no one thought would grow. "When I am a grown woman, I will marry you," she said, looking up with a certainty that did not belong to her size. He laughed, a short sound that was more surprise than cruel, and the wind carried the smell of newly baked bread and the faint metallic tang of the barn roof in the sun. What happened after that promise changed the course of two lives forever. It was a place of wide pastures and low fences, where mornings began with the creak of a gate and ended with lamps shading the kitchen table. The town had a single general store, a chapel with a chipped bell, and a lane that gathered dust in long summer afternoons. Mara Ellis had been small, sprightly, and unafraid at 10, and Ethan Granger was the kind of man whose laugh could make a child blink and rearrange a thought. She marched across the yard without a backward glance and spoke as if naming a fact. "I will marry you," she repeated, quieter this time. "Do you really mean that?" he asked, more kindly than she expected. "Yes," she said, "I mean it with my whole heart." 13 years later, Mara appeared at the farm gate holding a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and a look like weather. If this story touches you, subscribe to the channel and join us as we tell of promises, losses, and second chances that make whole lives bend toward each other. The first years after that promise were a map of ordinary details and the reactions of people who lived close enough to feel gossip like a neighborly breeze. The Granger place was more than a house with shutters. It was a compound of memory. The barn smelled of damp hay and horses, the pasture hummed with crickets at dusk, and the porch had a line of nail heads worn smooth by generations of boots. In those days, Mara was a child known to everyone. Ruth Ellis, her mother, ground wheat at dawn and hummed low hymns while kneading dough. Daniel Ellis, her father, firm-handed and soft-eyed, taught her to drive a cart by guiding the reins with his calloused palm. Jonas Holloway, the neighboring farmer, whistled when he walked by with his dog. And Maggie, the hired hand, tended the geese like they were small catastrophes that needed constant attention. In the general store, Mrs. Cabot stacked jars of jam beside jars of Kins and looked over her spectacles whenever a new piece of news arrived. People noticed the promise because it sat on the tongue like something too big for the day. The laughter that followed the declaration was not mean. It was the laugh of a man who had lost certain kinds of expectation and had the habit of meeting life with a practical smile. Still, after the children scattered to chores and the hens clucked into evening, Ethan would sometimes stand on the stoop and watch the clouds stretch. He called it a kind of quiet that keeps a place honest. "Do you really think you will one day be Mrs. Granger?" he said to her one evening when the light had a copper tint. "I do," she answered, and the smell of wood smoke braided with the sweetness of apple peel. The town commented, as towns do. Pastor Eli raised an amused eyebrow. Sheriff Carter shrugged and continued to mend a fence. Clara, the schoolteacher, told stories about promises that persisted and about time as a careful editor. Those small reactions framed the promise as a thing both fragile and stubborn. Time moved in seasons and in procedural steps that people of the farm counted as truth. Ethan married duty to the land and to the responsibilities left by his father. He taught a boy how to shoe a horse by holding the iron steady while the boy held the hoof. He went to town to pay a bill and came back with news that a distant aunt had died, and the estate carried with it debts and a house that groaned with old grief. He fell in love once, in a different way, with air heavy with possibility, only to lose that relationship to a fever that took a partner in a winter that moved slow as ice. He learned the vocabulary of loss: ledger, notice, probate, receipt. The farm grew quieter in certain rooms. A portrait that had hung in the hall grew dusty and was turned to the wall until someone had the courage to wipe it clean. The chapel bell began to toll for funerals more often than for weddings. In those years, the town learned to speak the name of sorrow with a different cadence. The child who had promised stayed a memory, a small echo on the porch. Mara Ellis grew older in a town that expected people to carry what was owed to them and to others. The wooden swing under the old oak tree took longer to come to rest, as if time itself were careful not to startle memory awake. Mara's growth into adulthood was not linear. She left at 16 to work as a seamstress in a town 2 rail stops away, and returned with pockets full of new measurements and a head full of plans. She learned to read invoices and to bargain for cloth, to measure with a tape that never lied, and to stitch seams that would stand up to long days. She refused several offers from men who admired her, polite refusals given with the same crispness as the hems she finished at midnight. She kept the promise in a private pocket like a talisman. Her backstory reads like a set of weathered letters, folded and refolded. As a child, she had been taught by her grandmother how to thread a needle and how to count a promise as a piece of sacred work. In adolescence, a teacher named Clara showed her how history can be a map to avoid repeating mistakes that look like fate. She learned to balance the need for independence with the hunger for belonging. The loss of her younger brother to an accident on a summer night cut a new channel in her heart that was not healed by distance. In the present, she had both a steadiness and a vulnerability. The memory of the promise lived beside the memory of the night she found her brother's hat at the bottom of the ravine. Those two images sat together and pushed her into decisions that sometimes seemed reckless to others. Her hands, always moving, carried scars from sewing and working with animals. The smell of starch and the sound of a sewing machine had become as familiar as church bells. This backstory of work, learning, grief, and a persistent promise formed the lens through which she returned to the farm. Ethan's own formation was carved by his hands on the plow and by memories that shaped the man he had become. He had learned responsibility before he had learned to read a town map. The death of his father had left him with ledgers and a mortgage and the knowledge that some things were not negotiable. He married once in a lean year and lost his wife to a sudden infection that swept the chapel into mourning and the kitchen into quiet. The grief did not look like one tide that went out. It looked like a set of rooms shutting down, one at a time. He found ways to work the land that felt like a conversation rather than a fight. He became adept at reading soil, at timing the sowing to the feel of the ground underfoot, at listening to the subtle cues the weather gave. The way the grass smelled before rain, the slickness of clay when frost came. He could tell by the way a horse shifted weight whether it was sore or tired. Those technical observations were a craft, and they shaped the patterns of his life. When Mara's voice had first declared that promise, he had been amused, not because he did not value the words, but because the world had taught him cynicism as a safeguard. His laugh in that moment was an armor and a confession. His backstory is threaded with duty and a private tenderness that rarely found a place to be spoken aloud. The portrait in the parlor, once taken down, was put back on the wall years later after someone dusted it gently and left a note that read simply, "We remember." These histories connected to the present like weather to the seasons. The decision that sent Mara back to the farm was not an accident. She had spent years gathering, saving, and learning how to convert small economies into ballast. She had made lists with careful handwriting, closing columns with steady zeros until the numbers showed that she could act. Daniel Ellis had taught her how a budget could be a trust, and Ruth Ellis had taught her how to cook for people when nights were long. She packed a satchel with clothes, a loaf of bread wrapped in linen, and a small parcel that held a silver locket. She told no one then that inside the locket there was a lock of hair from her grandmother and a pressed stem of lavender from the day she promised. The journey back was a wash of late sky and creaking roads. Along the way, she stopped at the general store and bought sunblock and a small pot of salve for blisters. She wanted to be presentable, not out of vanity, but out of intention. Her travel included a passenger seat next to a driver named Marco who told stories about the city with a certain kind gentleness, and a night at a board house where the smell of boiled cabbage and tobacco hung like a shawl. Each sensory detail shaped her readiness to return. She arrived at the farm with sun on her shoulders and a small surprise in mind, something that would ask of Ethan not only his kindness, but his willingness to let the past be a compass rather than a chain. When she walked up the lane and into the yard, the first adult conversation between them unfolded slowly and then with a speed that felt like wind moving a curtain. The scene required dialogue that unspooled like a cloth being stretched out to inspect for tears. The exchanges that followed became a hinge in the story. "You are not the little girl from the porch any longer," Ethan said, his voice lined with wonder. "No," she replied, stepping close enough to smell the faint scent of horse sweat and cedar smoke that clung to his shirt. "I am not." He set down a pail and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I have learned how to keep promises," she said, "and because certain things do not belong to the past alone." He looked at her with a caution that had been misread as indifference for too long. "What do you want from me?" he said, and there was a softness in the question that surprised them both. "To be allowed to try," Mara answered. "To be allowed to work alongside you," she added, and her voice was steady. They spoke of small things first, the weather, the cost of feed, the state of the roof. Then they moved to more intimate things, old hurts, the portrait in the hall, the way the town had changed. "Do you still laugh when you're surprised?" she asked. "I do," he said. "I laughed back then," she admitted, "and I have learned when to keep my laughter for myself." He smiled, a line that betrayed relief and old ache. "If you mean to stay," he said, "you must know the work is long and honest and the nights can be unforgiving." "I know," she said, and the sound of her agreement was like a hammer setting a peg into place. The early days of their renewed acquaintance were a litany of tasks and ritual repair. Mara slept in the small room above the pantry, where the floorboards creaked in familiar ways. She woke before the sun to the sound of cocks crowing and the smell of coffee that Ruth insisted was the only real way to greet a day. She learned the cadence of chores in a household that measured time by the fill of troughs and the weight of sacks. The narrative of these days must include sensory detail to anchor the emotional stakes. The odor of wet earth after a rain, the metallic ring of horseshoes on stone, the roughness of rope under palm, the sting of hay dust in the throat, and the cushion of warmth when a wool blanket is opened at night. Working side by side, they repaired fences, mended the net on the orchard, and sorted seeds with hands that grew calloused and steady. The town noticed the change in the routine. Jonas Holloway tipped his hat more thoroughly than before. Maggie offered a pie that vanished in one sitting. Pastor Eli stopped his sermons to ask after their welfare. Clara, the teacher, dropped off a stack of pattern books and a package of tea. Each reaction built a mesh of community that both supported and watched their movement toward whatever future would form. The pace of everyday tasks allowed silence to be shared and sometimes breached with small confessions. "Do you remember that summer with the green fireflies?" she asked, one dusk as they watched the sun slide down like warm butter. "I remember when you declared you would marry me, and I thought I would explode with laughter," Ethan said. "I do too," Mara answered, and the night smelled of lavender and hay smoke. As they moved into a rhythm of living, there were moments that forced a formal reckoning with what the promise had meant and what it could mean now. A key scene took place at the harvest table when old neighbors were invited to a meal as a way to say thank you to those who had helped in a lean year. There the town's voices braided. Sheriff Carter asked about the roads. Ruth Ellis laughed and offered more bread. Marco the transporter told a story about a city that sounded like a rumor. "Are you serious about her?" Jonas said, addressing the room in a way that made everyone look at Ethan. "I was a foolish man once," Ethan replied. "I can be serious and foolish in equal measure." Maggie, who had the habit of getting to the point, cleared her throat. "If you two want to build something, then build it strong," she said. "We do not have room for guessing," Clara offered, stirring her tea as if to clarify clarity through movement. The dialogue here was longer and deliberate, 8 to 10 exchanges that tested reputation and resolve. Each line carried the weight of community expectation and of private history. "We are not children," Mara said to the table, "but promises do not end because we change." "They bend," someone said, "and sometimes they break," Ethan answered. "Then we mend them," Mara said, and the room hummed with a collective intake of breath. The meal closed with stories and the scraping of plates and the smell of stew heavy with rosemary and thyme. Tension appeared not only between people, but within Mara and Ethan themselves. There were nights when old grief rolled in like wet fog, and they both had to stand their ground. A moment of inner conflict saw Mara holding a photograph that had belonged to his late wife, and confronting what it meant to love someone who had loved another. In 2 paragraphs that hold a particular pressure, she wondered whether stepping into a life shared with a memory was an act of bravery or trespass. The first paragraph tightened with the sound of rain on the roof and the scent of coal smoke pressing at the windows. She held the photograph and felt both tenderness and a small bruise of guilt. The second paragraph expanded into a decision point, where she chose acknowledgement over erasure and whispered to herself that standing in a place of truth was more honorable than hiding under the pretense of ease. This internal strain shaped conversations that followed and demanded that both of them speak more plainly than neighbors might expect. The narrative required a practical description of a process, as well a poetic rendering, to keep the world credible. When Mara helped with the hay baling, she learned the local technique in a sequence that is technical yet accessible. Hay baling begins with cutting the grass at optimal moisture to avoid molding, then letting it dry until the stems snap rather than bend. The baler collects the dried grass, compresses it with a fixed pressure setting, and ties the bale with twine that is wound consistently to prevent loosening during transport. Storing the bales in a ventilated barn on raised platforms avoids moisture damage and keeps feed ready for winter. This paragraph describes about the mechanics and the judgment calls that experienced farmers make each season. As their days interlaced, they discovered details that softened defenses and built new trust. Mara found an old portrait tucked behind a shutter in the parlor, a photograph of Ethan as a young man standing beside a woman whose smile suggested a tender, ordinary life. She confronted Ethan with it, and they spoke in a torrent of confessions. "Why did you hide her?" she asked. "I never hid her," he answered. "I was afraid to let her picture take up air in a house that felt like a wound." "You have lived with an empty chair," she observed, "not an absence, but a carefully preserved shape." "I was not sure if I could occupy the same space," he said. "I thought living and loving would be a desecration of memory." "But memories need company," Mara said, "and people need the chance to be present." The conversation contained 8 sharp exchanges, and it reopened the possibility that memory and new life could coexist. This dialogue was punctuated with sensory touches: the rustle of a curtain, a cup being set on the saucer, the distant cry of a fox. Those small details kept the scene grounded as feelings were named. Secondary characters wove in and out of the story, and they needed names and acts to give the community texture. Pastor Eli officiated over small-town rites and offered quiet counsel in the cool doorway of the church. Clara dropped off pattern books and lectured with the affectionate severity of a mentor. Sheriff Carter mediated disputes that had little to do with law and more to do with pride. Marco, the driver, told city stories and brought packages on rainy days. Ada, the midwife, arrived with knowledge and a basket when a child was born on a haymow, and she smelled of herbs. Jonas Holloway provided an opinion on most matters, and Maggie, the farmhand, kept the ledger of favors and debts balanced with a frank laugh. Each of these people performed small acts of attention. They delivered feed, they carried news, they swept the steps, and sometimes they gossiped in ways that hurt, and sometimes in ways that healed. Their names appeared throughout, as witnesses and as agents of change. Their presence created pressure and support in equal measure. The town did not always approve of the unspooling of an old promise into a new adult relationship. There were antagonisms from those who saw the promise as folly and from those worried about inheritance and property. An antagonistic figure emerged in the form of Thomas Corbett, a neighboring landowner with an eye on Ethan's property and a history of bitter competition. Thomas made innuendos at the market, suggested that Mara meant to take advantage, and pushed for a public assertion of intention that would put the couple under a microscope. He spoke sharply at the council meeting, insisted on legal clarity, and left rumors like footprints in the dust. This conflict required a confrontation, where words were tools and fear was an instrument. The couple responded not with drama, but with practical measures. They drew up a simple agreement, visited the registry, clarified ownership, and invited the town to witness acts of goodwill. The confrontation lasted across several scenes and culminated in a public hearing where facts were read aloud, witnesses called, and the town's sense of fairness tested. There, the community chose to respect the couple's agency. That moment served as a resolution of social pressure and a lesson about the balance between private promises and public life. Intimacy developed in small acts and in the exchange of stories with a depth that made them both visible to each other. They shared breakfasts of eggs soft with butter and coffee strong enough to steady a hand. Mara showed Ethan how to mend a tear in his coat with a neat, invisible stitch. Ethan taught Mara how to walk a foal to patience, encouraging it to accept a halter one step at a time. The sensory detail is important. Each morning the smell of sourdough starter, the dampness of the milk pail, the grit in the corners of the barn, and the prickle of cold when a winter wind found its way through cracks. Dialogue here deepens with 8 to 10 exchanges in scenes where trust and fear are traded and returned. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked, once during a night when the sky was full of stars like spilled salt. "Sometimes I regret things in the way you regret a scar," he answered. "I would rather have the scar than not have lived," she said. "We carry imperfect proof that we tried," he said, and they sat with the quiet knowledge that life was full of incomplete sentences and courageous continuations. 2 particular moments of tension emerged and demanded more than passing attention. In the first, there was a winter when crops failed and debts rose like a wall between hope and ruin. Ethan feared losing the farm, and with it the story he had inherited. In 2 paragraphs of tight narrative, the crisis compressed into details. The frozen hoses, the breath fogging in the kitchen, the literal sound of wood cracking in cold. They argued about whether to sell a parcel of land to cover costs, and whether selling meant failure. The dialogue was raw. "We will burn what we love to survive," Mara said. "We will not," Ethan replied. "What then do you propose?" she asked, and the exchange tested the foundation of their trust. The second moment came when Thomas Corbett spread a rumor that questioned Mara's motives. The town's reaction was a cocktail of whispers and curated silence. Mara felt the sting of public doubt, and Ethan the appetite of defense. In this compressed sequence, they had to choose whether to answer with anger or with measured action. They chose the latter by inviting the town into a shared day of labor, showing the reality of their lives through work rather than argument. That demonstration shifted the conversation and softened the edge of suspicion. Amid the pressures, there were moments that felt like harvests of joy. The birth of a child in late summer arrived with a small choir of helpers. Ada, the midwife, worked with practiced hands, while Ruth Ellis kept watch and cut rags for the baby that smelled of vernix and milk. The baby was named Liana, in honor of Mara's grandmother, and when she first opened her eyes, the house filled with a light that felt like possibility, given concrete form. The room was a study in senses, the warmth of a shawl, the dampness of new skin, the metallic tinge of sterilized scissors, the sweetness of boiled apple, and the low murmur of blessing. The community contributed a cradle, a basket of clothes, and a promise to watch over the child. That new life was a tangible outcome, a consequence of the promise that had been spoken under the weight of timber and sky. There was also a scene that required procedural clarity when they needed to update the registry and to clarify inheritance so that misunderstandings could not become wounds. The registrar required identification proof, a simple deed transfer, and witnesses to sign their names in the local book. The process took an afternoon and involved small-town bureaucracy, the folding of papers, the smell of ink, and the sound of a stamp. This step, practical and unsentimental, anchored their intentions into the legal world and quieted at least some of the rumblings. As the season turned, the relationship deepened, not because it was protected from doubt, but because doubt became a method of refinement. They argued about trivial things like whether to paint the fence white or leave it natural, and about significant things like how to speak to the child about promises and memory. Characters like Pastor Eli and Clara offered counsel and stories of other generations who had constructed marriages from broken pieces. Marco the transporter delivered a crate of books on local farming practices and gave a lecture on survival strategies. Jonas Halloway, who had been skeptical early on, became an ally in mending fences, literally and figuratively. The town's arc moved from curious amusement to cautious support and finally to open warmth. That change did not erase scars, but it provided a field in which healing could grow. Climax approached not as a single event, but as a sequence of decisions that put everything at stake. Thomas Corbett made a final push to force a legal sale and called a meeting at the county seat, where deeds were to be disputed. The gathering attracted neighbors and people from out of town who wanted to watch a small theater of property and pride. The hearing required testimony from witnesses, the presentation of ledgers, and the reading of a letter from a deceased relative that clarified terms. Ethan and Mara presented their case with the kind of plain truth that is compelling because it is not theatrical. They answered questions with steady voices and called for the town to testify to their character. In a sequence of several exchanges, their integrity was affirmed. The judge ruled in their favor on technical merits, and, more importantly, the community declared by presence and by small acts that the Granger place belonged to those who nurtured it. The scene ended with applause that was modest and honest, and with Thomas Corbett retreating to his barns where he could rearrange his grudges alone. Resolution came in a day of small ceremonies. They held a simple gathering on the porch with neighbors and a potluck of pies and savory casseroles. The ceremony was more a community blessing than a formal wedding. Pastor Eli presided and told stories of other marriages that began in odd ways. The child who had once promised was now a woman who had returned and whose promise had been transformed into practice and into a household that made room for memory and new life. In the exchange of vows, they spoke pragmatic words. "I promise to feed you and to be honest," Ethan said. "I promise to mend and to keep," Prara responded. The lines were simple and not theatrical, but they carried a gravity that the town felt in the bones. The photos taken for a local paper showed a small ring and a wide horizon behind them. The day smelled of hay and roses and the laugh of children. The epilogue must be precise and measured because it moves the camera forward in time to show consequences 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months later. 1 month later, the farm felt newly occupied in a way that was different from mere presence. The child who made the promise now moved like someone who knew the landscape's rhythms. The small routines had settled into grooves, and the cradle in the corner creaked like a metronome. The town visited more often, with pies and practical offerings. There were new habits. Mara had established a ledger for payment, a system for rotating chores, and a ritual of a weekly supper on Sundays, where neighbors brought stories. The light in the parlor returned somewhat, and the portrait that had once been turned now hung with a small garland. At the market, people nodded in a different style, their greetings warmer and less skeptical. The bread in the oven rose without drama, and the first winter supplies were stacked methodically in the shed. This month was a test, and they passed it by the accumulation of small, competent acts. 3 months later, the plot had deeper roots. Seed had gone into the ground, and sprouts had shown up like promises kept to the soil. The baby Leanna had been vaccinated and had a tiny burst of a laugh that made the house feel spacious. The couple had started a small produce table at the edge of town, selling eggs and jars of jam, and a neighbor had offered to help set up a rudimentary sign. The profits were small but steady and taught practical accounting lessons. They had hosted a barbecue for the town, and the food had been eaten with conversation and laughter long into evening. Thomas Corbett had not disappeared, but his attention had shifted, and his influence faded in the face of a palpable communal affection. The farm reported modest profit and greater stability, and the children of the village began to play under the same oak tree that had witnessed the original promise. 6 months later, tangible changes documented an evolution of life into legacy. The house had been repaired, a small annex added to accommodate guests, and a lockbox installed in the office kept important documents. They had hired Maggie full-time, and Marco arranged more regular transport routes that improved supply access. The baby was growing and beginning to walk with a wobbly confidence. Ethan had taught Mara a new method of crop rotation that increased yield and reduced pests. They had saved a buffer amount in their account, enough to consider investing in a small dairy formula that would smooth winter months. The town recognized the couple as a pillar rather than a curiosity. The harvest that season was healthy enough to donate baskets to families in need, reinforcing the couple's standing as contributors rather than claimants. In 6 months, the promise that had been spoken on a porch by a child had become a line in a ledger, and the ledger had become a map to survival and to tenderness. The epilogue shows that promises are living things that require work, soil, sun, and the discipline of honest accounting. Before closing, we pause to invite you into a conversation. If this part of the story moved you, please leave a comment and tell us how you would answer this question. Would you keep a promise made in childhood, even if the world told you not to? Do you think pledges from youth should guide adult choices? Answer beginning with, "I would keep it," or "I would not keep it," so readers can find your voice easily. Your comment helps build a community where different perspectives on duty, hope, and forgiveness can be heard and respected. Some will agree, others will challenge, and all voices shaped by real experience are welcome. Now that you have shared your view, we will continue and reveal what the future held for Mara, Ethan, and their town. In conclusion, the story is a study of how a single sentence spoken by a child can bend the arc of years. It shows that promises do not vanish because time moves. They either get built into life or left to erode. The result for Mara and Ethan was not a fairy tale, but a durable life made by work, ritual, and the willingness to speak truth. They had not escaped grief. They had woven it into a living tapestry by speaking openly and by letting the community participate. Practical tasks like organizing the registry or learning to bale hay mattered as much as confessions because they translated intention into reality. The child who had promised and the man who had laughed ended in a place where memory and new love can coexist and provide shade for future generations. If this story touched you, please subscribe for more narratives of rural endurance and human grace. Leave your thoughts below and share a story of a promise that changed your life. If you enjoy this video, consider hitting subscribe to follow more stories about courage, rebuilding, and the surprising ways people return to keep their word. Remember that a single promise kept can become a house full of life and shade for those who come after.